Detective Mark Peterson was cruising down the quiet suburban streets of the city when his eyes caught something that triggered a familiar instinct in him: a black woman in a shiny sports car driving a route that seemed out of place for someone like her. He quickly scanned the surroundings and made the decision to pull her over. Although there was no immediate reason for a traffic stop, the car was too sleek, too expensive for someone of her background. It wasn't the first time Peterson had relied on his gut feeling to make assumptions about the people he stopped, and this time he was sure something didn't add up. As he flipped on the siren and watched the car come to a halt on the side of the road, he couldn't help but feel a slight rush of satisfaction. He had caught someone. Ava Williams had been in the city for a few years now, working as a prosecutor for the state. And although she was proud of her success, she had long learned how to navigate the world with caution. She knew how people like Peterson saw her, the way they looked at her with suspicion, the way they judged her simply because of her skin and her car. She parked the vehicle and took a moment to steady herself. Before rolling down the window, she could already feel the weight of the situation in the air. It wasn't unusual for a woman of her stature to face prejudice, but it never made it any easier. Peterson approached the car with his usual confidence, ready to issue a ticket for a minor infraction, but he quickly grew suspicious of her calm demeanor. "Is there a problem, officer?" Ava asked politely, keeping her voice steady as she looked directly at him. Peterson scanned her face for any hint of discomfort or fear, but there was none. Ava remained composed, her hands placed firmly on the steering wheel and her gaze unwavering. It was as if she had been through this before. Peterson found that irritating. Didn't she know she should be nervous? Didn't she realize he had the power to make things difficult for her? He asked for her license and registration, his tone colder than necessary as he looked her up and down. Ava handed him the documents without hesitation, her fingers steady and sure. She had learned to anticipate the tension that came with situations like this and had perfected the art of remaining calm. Peterson didn't like it. Something about her seemed off to him. He glanced at the registration again and then at her face once more. It didn't match the image he had in mind for someone driving a car like this. He decided to dig deeper and asked her if she was carrying any illegal substances or weapons in the car. Without any evidence to support such an accusation, his voice was filled with unspoken assumptions. Ava felt her chest tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. She wasn't about to let him bait her into reacting. She had been trained to handle confrontations with people like Peterson. She had learned long ago that speaking out or getting upset would only play into their hands. She calmly asked if she was being detained or free to go. Peterson ignored her question, his focus now on his preconceived notion that she must be hiding something. Something wasn't right about this situation, and he was determined to figure it out despite the lack of any solid reason to continue the stop. Peterson's eyes narrowed as he stared at Ava. It was clear that she wasn't going to show the typical signs of guilt or fear that he was accustomed to seeing from people he stopped. He wondered why she wasn't flustered, why she wasn't at least giving him a little attitude. Her composed behavior only made him more suspicious. His mind raced back to a recent training session on how to spot people who seemed too calm. He had been told that it was a sign of arrogance or defiance. Maybe this was a case of someone trying to get away with something illegal, so he decided to take it further. Ava watched him with a steady gaze, but she could tell where this was headed. She had been in situations like this before, where a simple stop escalated into something much more petty and dangerous. She knew what people like Peterson thought of her. It wasn't about the law, it was about their perception of her. Peterson then told her that he was going to search her car, a routine request in his mind, and one that he expected her to reluctantly comply with. After all, he was the officer, and she was just a civilian who could argue with that. But Ava was no ordinary civilian. Her calmness turned to a subtle tension. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. It wasn't just a matter of a car search, it was a matter of dignity. She asked again if she was being detained, to which Peterson responded with a dismissive wave of his hand, telling her she had no choice but to let him search despite the fact that he had no reasonable cause to do so. Ava weighed her options. In that moment, her professional experience kicking in, she knew she could either push back and risk being arrested or comply and handle it later. The decision was made for her when Peterson took a step back and muttered under his breath that he wasn't going to waste any more time. He was going to arrest her for resisting arrest. The words hung in the air like a cruel joke, but they were no joke to Ava. Peterson had just escalated the situation into something much more serious, but Ava was still determined to remain calm. She didn't react with anger or shock. Instead, she simply repeated her question one more time. "Am I being detained?" And if so, why? Peterson's eyes flicked to the side for a moment, trying to figure out how to maintain control in this situation, but he couldn't help the slight frustration that seeped through. He wasn't used to being questioned like this, not by someone like her. Without realizing it, he had already made his decision. He snapped at her to step out of the car. Ava's heart began to race, but her exterior remained perfectly composed. She opened the door and stepped out of the vehicle, her movements deliberate and controlled. She knew that Peterson was itching to make this a bigger issue than it had to be, and she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. But even she could feel the tension rising as Peterson placed a hand on his radio and called for backup. He wasn't just arresting her for something as trivial as a traffic stop now. This was about proving he was in charge, and that people like Ava who didn't know their place needed to be put in it. Peterson's hand gripped Ava's arm more forcefully than necessary as he guided her toward the squad car. The movement was abrupt and sharp, like a man trying to assert dominance. He didn't seem to care that she hadn't shown any signs of resistance or aggression. Instead, he was focused on the idea that she needed to be humble, needed to be made an example of. The way his eyes flicked over to her car, as if he expected to find something incriminating, even though he had no reason to search it, only made Ava more certain that this wasn't about the law. It was about his need to maintain control. He shoved her into the back of the car with a little more force than required and slammed the door behind her. The sound echoed in the quiet night air, and for a brief moment, Ava felt a pang of anger rise up inside of her. But she quickly shut it down. The last thing she needed was to give Peterson any reason to escalate things further. Inside the squad car, Ava sat silently, staring out of the window, her mind racing through the possible consequences of what was happening to her. What would this mean for her career, her reputation? She had worked so hard to get to this point. And now it was all threatened by the actions of one officer who had made up his mind before he even spoke to her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the static crackle of the radio as Peterson called in to report the arrest. Though she could barely hear the words, she knew exactly what was being said. The officer's tone was sharp and confident, as if he had done nothing wrong. He was treating the situation like just another routine stop, even though Ava could feel that something deeper was happening here. She had heard the stories of other Black professionals who had faced similar situations and had hoped she would never become one of those stories, but now she was trapped in one, and it felt like the walls were closing in. The ride to the station was long and uncomfortable, not just because of the physical confinement, but because Ava was beginning to process what was happening to her. Peterson's attitude toward her was something she had experienced far too many times in her life. But this time it was different. This time he wasn't just an anonymous officer. He was someone who had made the decision to break the law, to target her based on assumptions alone. And that thought made her stomach churn. She had seen how the system worked. She had fought to change it from the inside, but now she was on the other side of it, trapped in the very system she had dedicated her life to reforming. As they pulled into the station, Peterson ignored her completely. Even as he opened the door and roughly pulled her out of the car, he didn't say a word as he marched her toward the booking desk, his hand still gripping her arm too tightly for her liking. At the desk, Ava was processed in silence, her fingerprints taken with no regard for the professional she was, or the career she had built. Peterson's earlier arrogance seemed to have faded into something colder. Now the weight of what he had done was beginning to sink in, but it was too late for regrets. She could feel the eyes of the officers around her, watching her closely, some with curiosity, others with disdain, but none with the respect she deserved. Peterson walked away without so much as a glance at her, leaving her in the hands of the booking officer, who barely acknowledged her presence. Ava's mind raced through every possibility she could think of, but her focus remained clear. She wasn't just going to let this go. She wasn't going to let Peterson or anyone else make her feel small for something that wasn't her fault. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger, and she wasn't going to let them win, not this time. Ava sat silently in the holding cell, her mind racing through the possibilities of what would come next. As she sat there waiting, she felt the familiar tension in her chest rise. She had been through tough situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a matter of a routine arrest. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding or a minor infraction. This was about something much deeper, something that reached to the core of who she was as a Black woman trying to navigate a system that wasn't built for her in the first place. Peterson had made it clear that her identity as a Black woman was enough of a reason for him to treat her as suspicious, to treat her as someone who didn't belong where she was. The thought of it made her blood boil. But she kept her composure. As always, she had no choice but to keep calm, to think rationally, even as the walls of the cell seemed to close in around her. Minutes turned into hours as she sat there alone with her thoughts, wondering how long it would take for someone to come for her. She had a lot of connections, she knew someone would come for her, but the question was who and how quickly time seemed to move slowly in the sterile, cold confines of the cell. Her fingers nervously tapped on the bench as she replayed the events of the evening in her mind over and over again. But no matter how many times she went over them, she couldn't find any way to explain what had just happened to her. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. How could this officer, someone in law enforcement, someone who was supposed to protect people, have treated her this way simply because of her race? She could feel the frustration growing, but she forced herself to stop thinking about it. She had to keep her head clear. She needed to make a plan. Finally, the door to the holding cell swung open and Ava looked up to see a familiar face. It was her assistant Kiera, who had rushed to the station the moment she found out about Ava's arrest. Kiera's face was a mixture of concern and disbelief, but it was also a face that was determined to fix things. Ava stood as Kiera walked in quickly and exchanged a brief but knowing glance with her. She didn't need to say anything for Ava to know exactly what was happening. Kiera was here to get her out, but more importantly, Kiera was here to make sure that Ava's arrest wouldn't go unnoticed. It wasn't just about getting her out of this mess, it was about making sure that what Peterson had done would be exposed for what it was. Without wasting any time, Kiera spoke with the booking officer and quickly made arrangements to get Ava out of the cell. She moved with purpose, her demeanor calm, but firm. Ava felt a sense of relief wash over her as she was escorted out of the holding area. The sight of the officer's indifferent face made her feel even more disgusted by the whole situation, but she refused to show it. She had bigger things to focus on now. Kiera handed Ava her coat as they walked toward the door, and Ava gave one last glance at the cell before stepping out into the night air. The cool breeze hit her face, and for a moment, Ava closed her eyes, breathing it in. She felt free again, but she knew that the battle was far from over. This was just the beginning. As Ava stepped out of the police station and into the night air, the weight of what had just happened started to sink in. She had been wrongfully arrested simply because of who she was and the assumptions made about her because of her race, but it wasn't over yet. It couldn't be over, not when the system had failed her so blatantly, not when the injustice had been so clear. Ava's resolve hardened as she walked alongside Kiera, who was already on her phone making calls with quick efficiency. Kiera had worked with Ava for years and knew how to handle a crisis, but even she was shocked by what had happened tonight. The news was already starting to spread, and she was already drafting a plan to protect Ava's reputation and career, but also to ensure that what Peterson had done would not be swept under the rug. Ava knew that things were about to get messy, but she was prepared for whatever would come next. They got into the car and Ava sat in silence as Kiera drove toward her apartment. She could feel the tension in the air, but she didn't speak immediately. She wasn't sure what to say. What could she say in this moment? Kiera glanced over at her and gave her a reassuring look before speaking. Ava, you're going to be okay. We're going to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed. I'm going to get a lawyer. We'll file a lawsuit. We'll go public with this, but you need to stay strong. Ava nodded, though the words felt hollow to her. She wasn't worried about herself. She wasn't worried about her career. What bothered her was the fact that Peterson had been able to do this with impunity, without even questioning his own actions, without understanding the damage he had caused to her, but more importantly to the system that was supposed to protect everyone. As they arrived at Ava's apartment, Kiera parked the car and they both got out quickly. Kiera started dialing her contacts again as they walked toward the building. Ava's mind was already moving ahead to the next step. She knew the fight wouldn't be easy, but she had no intention of backing down. She wasn't just going to let Peterson's actions slide. She wasn't going to allow him to get away with using his position to degrade and humiliate her simply because of who she was. What made her even more determined was the thought of how many other people had faced this exact kind of treatment, how many others had been targeted and marginalized by officers like Peterson without any recourse. It was something that Ava couldn't ignore. She had worked too hard to change the system, and now she had a first-hand understanding of how broken it was. Back in her apartment, Ava poured herself a glass of water and sat down on the couch. Kiera was already on the phone with a civil rights attorney who specialized in cases like this. Ava listened in as Kiera explained the details of the arrest and the potential legal action it could take. She could hear the attorney's voice through the phone and the seriousness with which he was listening to the situation. Kiera nodded and ended the call, then turned to Ava. We've got a strong case. We're going to take this to court and make sure Peterson faces the consequences for what he did. Ava exhaled slowly. She knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but she also knew that this was no longer just about her. This was about making sure that no one else would have to face the same kind of injustice she had just experienced. She wasn't going to let it go. She couldn't. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings, and strategy sessions. Ava worked closely with Kiera and the attorney to gather evidence and testimonies to build their case. They contacted witnesses from the station and started collecting footage from the dashcam cameras as well as from nearby security cameras. They knew the evidence would speak for itself. But even more than that, Ava knew the case would be a public one, and she was ready to make sure the truth came out no matter how difficult the journey would be. As the days passed, Ava felt the pressure mounting, but she also felt an undeniable sense of purpose. She had been through tough times before, but this was different. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about the system that allowed officers like Peterson to behave with impunity. It was about showing the world that even in positions of power, there were consequences for actions driven by bias and ignorance. Ava knew that her case would draw attention, but she was ready for it. The phone calls kept coming. The media reached out for statements and interviews while her team worked tirelessly behind the scenes to gather the necessary evidence. They had already secured footage of the traffic stop from a nearby security camera and the dashcam footage from Peterson's patrol car. The recordings were clear and undeniable. They showed Peterson's escalating behavior from the moment he approached Ava's car to the point where he forcibly arrested her without any reasonable cause. Ava spent long hours meeting with her legal team, going over the footage and preparing for the inevitable court battle. She was no stranger to the pressure that came with being in the public eye, but this case felt more personal than any other she had handled before. It wasn't just about the law, it was about dignity. It was about fighting back against an injustice that had plagued not just her but so many others who had been wrongfully targeted and treated unfairly simply because of their race. She had spent years fighting on the other side as a prosecutor, but now she was the one who needed to be heard, and she wasn't going to back down no matter what. The media frenzy around her case only intensified as details of the arrest began to surface and public outrage grew. Ava was praised for her calm composure during the arrest, but it was the footage that truly captured the public's attention. It was impossible for anyone to deny that Peterson's actions were motivated by racial profiling. Ava's legal team began drafting a lawsuit against the police department and Peterson. Personally, the case would be filed in both civil and federal court, and they were prepared to make sure the issue was addressed at the highest levels. The pressure on the department mounted, and soon enough calls for accountability flooded social media and news outlets. As Ava's story gained traction, it became clear that this wasn't just about her arrest anymore. This was about holding law enforcement accountable for actions that perpetuated systemic racism and discrimination. Despite the overwhelming support Ava received from the public and her colleagues, there were still moments when the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm her. She could feel the strain in her shoulders and the exhaustion in her bones. But she refused to let it show. She had to stay strong. She had to remain focused on the larger goal. It was in those quiet moments alone when she allowed herself to think about what this all meant for her personal life, her family, and her career. She had always worked hard to prove herself in the courtroom and had spent years earning respect in a field that often seemed inhospitable to people like her. But now she was forced to confront the ugly reality that no matter how far she had come, no matter how much she had achieved, there would always be those who saw her as nothing more than a stereotype. She thought about her parents who had raised her to be proud of who she was, to stand tall in the face of adversity, and to never let anyone define her worth. Ava knew they were watching all of this unfold, and she promised herself that she would not let them down. She would not let Peterson or anyone else take away her sense of self. As the days turned into weeks, the momentum behind Ava's case only grew. Her team worked tirelessly, gathering support from civil rights organizations and legal experts who rallied behind her. The pressure on the police department was undeniable, and the calls for change continued to grow louder. Ava knew this fight would be long and challenging, but she also knew that she was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of their race, and she wouldn't stop until justice was served. The court date was set, and Ava could feel the weight of everything that had been building toward this moment. She had spent weeks preparing with her legal team, reviewing every piece of evidence and anticipating the tactics Peterson's defense team would use against her. She had expected the case to get ugly, but nothing could have prepared her for the emotional toll it would take sitting in that courtroom, knowing that every word spoken and every argument made would carry the weight of her entire fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been subjected to the kind of injustice she had faced that night in the traffic stop. Peterson's actions were about to be scrutinized in front of a judge and a jury, but Ava knew that the system wasn't always on the side of justice. It wasn't always about what was right. It was about who had the power to make things go their way, and she could feel that reality pressing down on her even as she sat tall in the witness stand. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. The opposing attorneys tried to paint a picture of a routine traffic stop gone wrong that somehow spiraled into something much bigger than it needed to be. Peterson's defense attorney claimed that his client had acted in good faith, that he had simply been doing his job trying to ensure public safety. But Ava knew better. She had the evidence on her side. She had the footage from the dashcam that showed how Peterson had escalated the situation based solely on her appearance, and nothing else. Her lawyer made sure to highlight every detail of Peterson's actions, every moment that showed he had targeted Ava because of her race, and nothing else. The prosecution argued that Peterson's treatment of Ava was not just a mistake, but part of a larger pattern of racial profiling that had no place in modern policing. They reminded the court that Ava was not just any woman. She was an accomplished state lawyer, someone who had worked hard to get where she was, someone who had proven herself in every arena, but despite her success and professional status, she had still been treated like a criminal. As Ava took the stand and recounted the events of that night, she could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her. Every word, every gesture felt magnified. Her hands were steady as she spoke, but her heart raced with the tension of the moment. She told the court about the moment Peterson had pulled her over, and the subtle discomfort she felt in his eyes, the way he had looked at her with suspicion, as if she didn't belong in that car, in that neighborhood. Despite all of her accomplishments, despite all of the work she had put into building her career, in that moment, she was just another black woman behind the wheel of an expensive car. In the eyes of an officer who had already decided what kind of person she was, the thought of it made her stomach churn. But she pushed through. She knew that telling her story was important. She knew that it would make a difference. Her voice shook slightly as she described how Peterson had demanded to search her car without any probable cause, and how he had used force to arrest her, even though she had done nothing wrong. She explained how she had remained calm because she knew that reacting angrily or defensively would only make things worse. But even in her calmness, Peterson had taken it as a sign of guilt and had used it to justify his actions. Ava could see the jury listening intently, and she knew that this moment was pivotal. The courtroom was silent as she spoke, and Ava held her head high, her conviction stronger than ever. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been wrongfully targeted or mistreated by the system she had dedicated her life to changing. As her testimony came to a close, Ava felt a sense of both relief and exhaustion, but she wasn't done yet. The road ahead was still long and filled with obstacles and uncertainties, but as she walked back to her seat, her eyes met the gaze of Peterson's defense attorney, and she knew then that this fight was about more than just the verdict. It was about making sure that the voices of those who had been silenced for too long would finally be heard. The trial stretched on for days, with each passing moment feeling heavier than the last. Ava could sense the tension in the courtroom building as Peterson's defense team fought tooth and nail to discredit her. They attempted to paint her as a liar, as someone who was simply exaggerating the situation, trying to turn a routine arrest into something bigger than it was. They played clips from the dashcam footage out of context, hoping to sway the jury into thinking that Peterson had acted within his rights. They questioned her every move, every word, trying to make it seem like she was the one who had escalated the situation. But Ava stood firm. She didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She knew the truth, and she knew that no matter how hard they tried to twist it, the facts spoke for themselves. Her legal team countered each attack with precision, showing how Peterson had acted out of bias, how he had targeted her based solely on the color of her skin and not on anything that she had actually done. They highlighted how his own actions had forced the situation to escalate, and how Ava had tried to de-escalate with calm professionalism. The contrast between their approaches was stark, and as each day passed, Ava could feel the weight of the case becoming more and more real. During one of the breaks, Kiara pulled Ava aside, her face filled with concern. "Ava, this is getting really personal. They're trying to make you seem like the villain here. Don't let them get to you." Ava took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. But the words stung. She had known that this trial would be difficult, but she hadn't expected the level of attack on her character. Peterson's defense attorney was relentless, using everything from her profession to her personal life to try and paint her as a person who didn't belong in the courtroom. In that moment, Ava could feel the exhaustion creeping in, the pressure of the trial, the media, the public eye. It was all starting to take its toll. But she couldn't stop now, not when so many people were relying on her to stand tall and speak the truth. She nodded at Kiara and said, "I'm fine. We can't let them win." She meant it. She couldn't let them undermine the very reason she was there. This wasn't just about her. This was about everyone who had been subjected to the same type of treatment, who had been wrongfully arrested or mistreated because of their skin color. She had to keep going no matter how hard it became. As the trial entered its final days, both sides made their closing arguments. Ava's legal team made a passionate plea to the jury to hold Peterson accountable for his actions, to send a message that racial profiling would not be tolerated in their community. They spoke about the need for systemic change and the importance of fair treatment for all citizens, no matter their race. Peterson's defense attorney tried to spin the narrative, once more attempting to frame the situation as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But the evidence was clear: the dashcam footage, the testimonies, the way Ava had been treated. There was no denying it. The truth was on her side. When it was Ava's turn to speak, she didn't hesitate. She addressed the jury directly with a calm, a powerful voice. "This isn't just about me. This isn't just about one officer's bad decision. This is about a system that allows this kind of behavior to happen day in and day out to countless people who look like me, who don't have the voice or the resources to fight back." She paused, letting the words sink in. Her eyes scanned the jury. She knew they were listening, but she also knew that this wasn't just about convincing them. It was about making them see the bigger picture. "What happened to me wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was the result of a pattern of behavior that has gone on for far too long. And if we don't stand up now, if we don't make sure that this never happens again, we're complicit in allowing this injustice to continue." Ava's voice never wavered as she made her final plea. Her words resonated deeply with everyone in the courtroom. The room was silent as Ava sat down, her heart pounding in her chest. As the jury deliberated, she had said everything she needed to say. Now it was out of her hands. She could only hope that her truth would be enough to break through the barriers of bias and injustice, and that the jury would do the right thing. The hours dragged on as the jury deliberated. Ava sat in the courtroom with her legal team, waiting for the verdict to be read. The tension in the air was palpable. Every minute felt like an eternity, and Ava's thoughts raced. She had done everything she could. She had told her story with honesty and courage. But now it was out of her hands. She had no control over what the jury would decide. All she could do was wait. The courtroom was filled with people who had come to witness the trial: the reporters, lawyers, family, and friends. All eyes were fixed on the door where the jury would emerge to announce their decision. Ava felt a knot in her stomach as she tried to calm her breathing. But it was no use. She couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would define everything she had worked for: her career, her future, her sense of justice. All of it hinged on what the jury would say. After what seemed like forever, the door to the jury room finally opened, and the foreperson stepped forward, holding the slip of paper that would determine the outcome of the case. Ava's heart skipped a beat as she watched the foreperson walk toward the judge with slow, deliberate steps. It felt like time had stopped as the judge took the paper and read it aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Peterson, guilty of racial profiling and unlawful arrest." The words hit Ava like a wave. Her chest tightened, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. It was a mixture of relief and disbelief. She had won, but the victory felt surreal. She had fought so hard for this moment, and now it was here. The room erupted into a mixture of gasps and applause as people realized the gravity of the decision. Ava felt Kiara's hand on her shoulder, and she turned to face her friend, who was beaming with pride. "You did it, Ava," Kiara whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Ava nodded, still processing the verdict. She had expected to feel jubilant, but instead she felt a deep sense of quiet triumph. It wasn't about the victory for her. It was about what the victory meant for everyone else, for all the people who had been subjected to the same injustice, who had been denied their rights simply because of the color of their skin. She knew this was just one step, but it was an important one. It was a sign that the system could be held accountable, that those in positions of power couldn't act with impunity anymore. As the judge read the full details of the verdict and the legal consequences for Officer Peterson, Ava felt a sense of closure begin to wash over her. But she also knew that this wasn't the end of the fight. This was just the beginning. Peterson had been found guilty, but there were still so many people out there who continued to suffer under the same biases and injustices that had almost taken everything from her. She knew that her work wasn't finished. The fight for justice wasn't over just because she had won this case. She had gained something valuable, something far more important than the victory itself. She had gained the power to continue speaking out, to continue fighting for those who had no voice. As the courtroom emptied, Ava stood with Kiara by her side, feeling the weight of everything finally begin to settle. She had done it. She had taken a stand and shown the world that no one was above the law, not even those who wore badges of authority. It was a small but significant victory in the larger battle for equality and justice. But Ava knew that it was a victory worth fighting for. She smiled at Kiara, who was still grinning with pride. "This is just the start," Ava said softly, her voice resolute. "There's so much more to do." Kiara nodded in agreement, and together they walked out of the courtroom, knowing that the fight wasn't over, but that for the first time in a long time it felt like they were on the right path. The days following the verdict were a blur for Ava. The victory in court was celebrated by many, but it didn't feel like an end to the battle. It was a reminder of how much work was still left to be done. The media continued to cover her case relentlessly. Reporters hounded her with questions about what the verdict meant and what would come next. Ava found herself at the center of a national conversation about racial profiling and police reform. It was a position she never imagined herself in. But she knew she couldn't shy away from the responsibility that came with it. Everywhere she went, people stopped her to congratulate her, to share their own stories of injustice, and to thank her for standing up for what was right. It was overwhelming, but it also reinforced the reason she had fought so hard. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for all those who had been wronged in silence for so long. Kiara was by her side every step of the way, making sure she stayed focused and grounded amid the storm of attention. Kiara knew how to keep Ava grounded, reminding her of the bigger picture and the importance of not losing sight of the goal. There were meetings with civil rights organizations, lawyers, and activists who wanted to work together to push for broader reforms. Ava was suddenly thrust into a leadership role she hadn't anticipated, but she embraced it. She knew that the change she wanted to see couldn't come from just one case. It had to come from collective action. It had to come from those who were willing to keep pushing even when it felt like the system was too broken to fix. Behind the scenes, Ava continued to work tirelessly on policy reform efforts. She met with lawmakers who were drafting new legislation to address racial profiling and the use of excessive force by police officers. She participated in town halls and public forums where she shared her experiences and listened to the stories of others who had faced similar treatment from law enforcement. She knew that the legal victory she had won was only a small piece of the puzzle, and that the real work was in the long-term efforts to change the culture of policing in America. But she was determined to keep going even when the weight of the fight felt overwhelming. It wasn't long before Ava was invited to speak at a major conference on police accountability and racial justice. The event would bring together some of the most influential figures in law enforcement, activism, and politics. It was a chance for Ava to take her fight to a larger stage and to push for real change. The night before her speech, she found herself alone in her hotel room, staring out the window. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment: the long hours of work, the years of pushing against the odds, the personal sacrifices, the pain of being judged and underestimated. All of it had led her here, and now she had the chance to make a difference on a much larger scale. She felt a sense of purpose settle over her as she prepared to speak to an audience that could help shape the future of the movement. The next day, Ava took the stage with confidence. She spoke about her own experience, but also about the experiences of countless others who had been victims of racial profiling and police brutality. She shared her story not as a personal triumph, but as a call to action. She urged the audience to see the reality of the systemic issues within law enforcement and to push for policies that would ensure fairness and accountability. She spoke about the need for better training for police officers, the importance of community policing, and the necessity of holding officers accountable for their actions. Her words resonated deeply with the crowd, and afterward, she was approached by many who wanted to work with her to bring about change. Ava realized in that moment that her fight wasn't just about winning a case, it was about igniting a movement. It was about creating a future where no one would have to face the same kind of injustice she had faced. As Ava left the conference that day, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She had become a symbol of hope for many, but she knew her journey was far from over. The victory in court was only the beginning. Now she was ready to fight for systemic change and to make sure that her story wasn't just a moment in time, but the spark that would ignite a larger movement for justice and equality. The days after the conference passed quickly. Ava found herself inundated with requests for interviews and speaking engagements, but despite the attention, she remained focused on her larger goal. The movement for racial justice had gained momentum in the wake of her case, and Ava was determined to keep it moving forward. Her team continued to work on legal strategies to challenge systemic issues within policing, while Ava met with local leaders, activists, and lawmakers to help shape new policies. She knew that the path to true change wouldn't be easy, but she was prepared to continue pushing. As the discussions around police reform grew louder, she found herself being invited to more and more meetings where influential figures spoke about the necessary changes and the need for reform in policing. Ava sat in those rooms listening carefully, taking in the perspectives of those who had been fighting this battle long before her, but she also made sure to add her voice to the conversation, reminding everyone that real change meant not just creating new laws, but also shifting the culture within law enforcement itself. One afternoon, Ava received a phone call that would change the course of her work forever. It was from a group of concerned parents who had been working to create a national organization aimed at holding police departments accountable for their actions. They had heard about her work and the verdict in her case, and they wanted to know if she would be willing to help lead the charge for this new initiative. Ava listened carefully. As they described their vision for the organization, they wanted to create a powerful coalition that would unite families and communities who had been affected by police violence and racial profiling. They wanted to build a platform that would allow people to tell their stories and make sure that their voices were heard. Ava's heart raced as she listened to their vision. She knew that this was exactly the kind of work she had been hoping to do. But on a larger scale, she also knew that taking on such a responsibility would mean even more pressure and sacrifices. But she didn't hesitate for a second. She said yes without hesitation because she knew it was the right thing to do. The organization quickly gained traction with Ava as one of its leading advocates. They started organizing rallies, marches, and town halls to raise awareness and to demand accountability from law enforcement agencies across the country. Ava traveled to cities and towns that had been plagued by police violence, meeting with families who had lost loved ones to police brutality, listening to their pain, and supporting them as they fought for justice. She was deeply moved by the strength and resilience of these families, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose every time she heard their stories. They weren't just statistics, they were people who had suffered unimaginable loss and were now fighting to make sure that no one else had to endure the same fate. Ava's work with the organization became all-consuming, but it was also incredibly rewarding. She helped shape new policies that would push for greater transparency in police departments and better resources for communities affected by law enforcement violence. She advocated for new laws that would hold police officers accountable for their actions, and she pushed for better training on de-escalation tactics and anti-racism for law enforcement personnel. But as the months passed, Ava found herself stretched thinner and thinner. She was constantly on the road, juggling multiple responsibilities at once, and it began to take a toll on her health and personal life. Kiara was the first to notice the signs. She saw how tired Ava was, how she was pushing herself to the limit, and how she was starting to withdraw from the people who cared about her. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Kiara sat down with her. "Ava, you've been going nonstop for months. Now you need to take a break," Kiara said gently. "I know you're doing important work, but you also need to take care of yourself." Ava looked at her friend with gratitude, but also with a sense of guilt. She had been so consumed by the mission that she had neglected her own well-being. "I can't stop now," Ava replied. "There's too much at stake." Kiara nodded. "I know, but you can't keep pouring from an empty cup," she said, her voice soft but firm. Ava took a deep breath and realized Kiara was right. The work would always be there, but she couldn't keep getting everything she had if she didn't take care of herself first. Ava knew that finding balance would be a challenge, but she also knew that it was necessary to keep fighting for the change she wanted to see in the world. She promised Kiara that she would take some time for herself to recharge and refocus, because she knew that to keep making a difference, she had to stay strong both physically and emotionally, and she couldn't do that without taking care of her own needs. Ava spent the next few weeks taking time for herself as best as she could. She took walks in the park and spent quiet evenings at home with Kiara. The small moments of peace helped her to clear her mind and recharge her energy. But the truth was, she knew she couldn't completely step away from the fight. The calls for police reform were growing louder across the nation, and Ava had become a central figure in that movement. Everywhere she went, she was greeted by people who thanked her for her courage, and the stand she had taken. Her name was now known far and wide, and with that came new opportunities to advocate for justice. But there were also new pressures as more was expected of her. Every day, the phone calls, the meetings, the interviews, the endless paperwork, it all began to pile up again. But Ava had learned an important lesson during her time away from the front lines. She realized that taking care of herself wasn't a sign of weakness. It was necessary for her to continue the work she had started. Ava's team continued to push for systemic change on multiple fronts. They worked with lawmakers to propose new legislation and met with law enforcement agencies to push for policy changes that would address racial profiling and the use of excessive force. They advocated for better training for police officers and worked to make sure that community voices were included in discussions about police reform. But as the months passed, Ava began to feel the weight of it all. There were victories, but there were also setbacks. There were moments of progress followed by moments where it seemed like nothing was changing at all. Ava sometimes wondered if the battle would ever truly be won, but then she would think back to her own experience, the way she had stood tall in that courtroom and fought for what was right, and she knew she couldn't stop now. One afternoon, Ava received a call from a young woman named Jasmine who had been the victim of racial profiling during a traffic stop. The woman told Ava how she had been treated unfairly by an officer who had questioned her simply because of her race and had used excessive force when she tried to defend herself. Jasmine's story struck a chord with Ava, who immediately offered her support. She made sure that Jasmine had access to legal resources and offered guidance on how to navigate the legal system. She knew that Jasmine's story wasn't unique, but it still made Ava angry that the system had failed yet another person who had done nothing wrong but looked a certain way. Ava promised Jasmine that she would keep fighting for change, that her story wouldn't be forgotten, and that she wouldn't be alone in this struggle. It was in moments like these that Ava realized how much work was still left to be done, even with the successes of her own case and the growing national conversation about police reform. There were still so many people whose voices had yet to be heard, so many whose lives had been upended by systemic injustice. Ava's resolve strengthened as she spoke with Jasmine and countless others whose experiences mirrored her own. She knew that the fight for equality would take years, if not decades, but she also knew that it was a fight worth having, a fight that was worth every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. She knew that change wasn't something that happened overnight. It was something that was built piece by piece through the stories of those who had been silenced, through the work of those who were willing to stand up and demand better. Ava continued her work, but she no longer felt like she had to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders alone. She had built a strong network of allies who shared her vision for a just society, and together, they kept pushing forward. Even when it felt impossible, she realized that the journey was long and uncertain, but as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, she would never give up on the fight for justice. As the years passed, Ava found herself standing at the crossroads of change. She had become more than just a symbol of resistance. She had become a driving force in the fight for justice and reform. Her name was now synonymous with the movement for racial equality, and her journey had taken her from a quiet corner of the courtroom to the halls of power. Ava knew she had made an impact, but she also understood that the fight was far from over. The victories were bittersweet, and the losses were painful. But with each step forward, the cause grew stronger, and the message clearer that no one would be left behind. One day, Ava found herself in Washington, D.C., speaking to a room full of lawmakers about the need for police accountability and community-based solutions. She had been invited to testify before a special committee tasked with addressing police reform. The room was filled with a mixture of skepticism and hope. Some of the lawmakers were genuinely interested in change, while others were more resistant to the idea of overhauling the system. Ava felt the weight of the moment as she stood before them, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She spoke about the stories of the countless individuals whose lives had been ruined by racial profiling and police brutality. She shared her own story, but also the stories of the mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters who had been affected by the same systemic issues she had faced. She spoke not just as a lawyer or an activist, but as someone who had lived through the pain and injustice she was fighting to change. After she finished speaking, there was a long silence in the room. Ava felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. She had poured everything into her words, but she couldn't predict how they would land on the people in the room. She watched as some lawmakers whispered among themselves, others looked at her with wide eyes, and for a moment she wondered if her message had even reached them. But then something unexpected happened. A voice from the back of the room spoke up. A congresswoman who had been quiet throughout the session stood and said, "Ava, you're right. We can't keep ignoring this. We can't keep pretending that things are fine when so many people are suffering. We need to make real change, and we need to do it now." The room grew quiet as other lawmakers nodded in agreement, and for the first time in a long time, Ava felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the tides were turning. The next few weeks were a whirlwind as Ava worked closely with the lawmakers who were now committed to drafting new policies that would address racial profiling and police brutality. She spent hours reviewing the proposed